so hopefully some people will show up.
Okay.
Yeah, earlier in the year, one of my superintendent friends told me, he said, when these kids start going back to school, he says, it doesn't matter if we wear masks. He said, those ventilation systems, he said, it's going to be all in the building. And he says, you watch a couple of months after school starts, this thing's going to spike. And he's like, if it's really that real and contagious. And I'm looking back on that now thinking he knew exactly what he was talking about.
Well, they've been around the block a time or two with childhood illnesses, so the COVID is just too pervasive.
Hi, Bob.
Hello, Lori. How are you doing?
I'm good. I made you co-host. Are you going to need to share your screen?
Well, I guess I could. I'd have to go to, I guess, the email or something, or where I have the material.
Well, we sent it
okay.
out. So, I mean, if you have it in front of you and everyone else has it, I don't know that it's necessary to share your screen unless there's something extra you want to do. I can do that for you. Otherwise,
Okay.
you proceed.
Okay. That sounds good.
If anyone's on the call and they did not see the email or have the paperwork, if they'll just let us know in the chat, I can email it to them.
Okay, great.
All right.
So are we all, does everybody know that we're having that sterilization or treatment or whatever, 11 o'clock Wednesday? So we'll be shut down the rest of the day for that and then closed Thursday and Friday. Is that the schedule?
Yes, sir.
So will they, how long Wednesday is the treatment take? Do you know?
It doesn't take long, but the agents, everyone will have key fob access by 8 o'clock the next morning. I'm about
Okay.
to post on Facebook and send a message out as well.
Okay, so do they spray?
Yeah, it's a chemical fog that they're doing.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it doesn't mess up any your desktop. No, it doesn't do any harm to anything at all. It's just a
Okay, so it doesn't
Carbon
mess up the paperwork that's out.
nope.
Good.
Nope.
Good. That's good to know. I was talking to another company and they use a spray thing and they say, make sure all your paperwork is put away because the spray stuff really affects the paper. So it's good to know we've got something better than that.
Yeah.
That's good. Well,
And
looks like we got about.
Tomorrow is pick up our pie day.
That's right.
Mhm. I think it's a pretty nice thing that everybody's doing. That's
I
good.
think it's wonderful.
Okay, I'm gonna go get my last piece of nutrition, i.e. my Coca-Cola, and I'll be ready to start. Okay, Lori, I think I'm ready to get started. We got, 23 people here? And I know we'll have some people kind of wander in. I've got a couple things that I do want to talk about that's not in the material. And I'm trying to decide if I should wait more towards the end while we're letting people still come in, as opposed to doing it right now. So I think right now we'll just get right into the multiple offers materials. And this is a kind of a continuation of what we started in the last class. We got about a third of the way through in the first handout. And this is the last 2/3. It's a larger handout and covers more in the multiple offers. And one of the things I want to say about multiple offers, and I think everybody will kind of pick up on this as we talk about it. There are some things that are unique in a multiple offer scenario and some things we need to really be very sensitive of, and we'll talk about that. But many of the techniques we use in a multiple offer, we should use in a normal transaction. And when we got the listing and we just have one buyer, or we have the buyer, whether we're competing with other offers or not, there's some things that we would do just in a single offer situation. And so as we go through this, I'll touch on from time to time some of the things that will apply not just in multiple offer situations, but frankly in any transaction as we work through it. Well, everybody be prepared to make comments and ask questions as we kind of go through all this. So we'll start off with your handout there, which at the top says multiple offer, and it talks about 3 rules. And the first rule is it says all buyers must have the same level of information. And then it gives us 4 things about telling us what that means. And one of the things that we'll learn when we talk about this is who controls and who makes the decision about what the buyer's information would be. So the first thing is it could be nothing. You know, the seller could make a decision and say to you, the listing agent, I don't think it's right. I don't think it's kind. I don't think it's nice. In fact, I think it's very vicious to pit people against each other. And I don't want to get into a competing offer situation. So I don't care if we have 1 offer or 5 offers or 50 offers. No one's going to know they're in a competing offer situation. Seller gets to make that decision. Now, as we go through the process of dealing with multiple offers and the process of the decision makers, i.e. being the principals, the seller and the buyer, we need to recognize that they're making these decisions with our advice. We're not just stepping back and say, hey, you know, whatever you want to do, just tell me and we'll do it. They need the benefit of your experience. They need for you to advise them. And when the seller says, and it's not an unreasonable thing, we've had sellers who say, you know what? I don't want to talk about it. I don't want anybody to know about multiple offers. You know, they get to make that decision, but here's what we kind of say to our seller. Says, okay, we respect that. You get to do it. I will try to do my best to communicate that. But seller, you need to know when a buyer's agent asks me, and they will, they'll ask me if there are other offers. When they ask me that, if I say anything other than no, they'll know there are other offers. If I say, well, you know, my seller has not authorized me to talk about multiple offers, where they exist or don't exist, buyer's agent's going to know that there are other offers, and there probably are. Now, we're clear you can't lie about it. You know, if in fact there are no other offers, you can honestly say no. If there are other offers, you cannot say no. Seller cannot instruct you to say no, because that'd be lying, and you can't do that. You know, you're going to have to find an effective way to say to that buyer's agent, you know, that's a very reasonable question. That's a question that every good buyer's agent would ask. My seller has made the decision that he's not willing to go down the competing offer road. He's not willing to pit buyers against each other. So whether or not we have other offers or not, my seller is not authorizing me to tell you that. And then you stop, because any further conversation and they're going to pull something out of you. So the more effective you have that you can say that type of thing, the better off you're going to be, understanding that the reality is the typical buyer's agent, it depends a little bit on who it is, and by the way, it depends on their relationship with you, who they are, how they know you, they've done business with you, all that comes into play. But as you go through that situation, when you do anything other than simply say no, they're going to be suspicious that there are other offers. In fact, that's probably what we're going to tell their buyer. They're going to say to their buyer, you know what? We don't know if there are other offers. It's not information the sellers authorized the listing agent to say. We suspect they are. And frankly, a good buyer's agent, because they know the market and they know that type of property, they're going to already know whether there probably are or will be other offers. A good buyer's agent's going to know that. So when you go through that process, it's going to be important when you have a situation where you can't tell them. You're going to have to do that in a good way, because you want to maintain and move forward that good relationship with that buyer's agent, because that's going to make a difference as you move forward and negotiate offers and get to a contract. So you need to develop a good script, become effective at going through that process and being able to tell them. So as we look at rule number 1, the first thing is the information buyers could get just could be nothing. And that's always a seller decision, never an agent decision, always a seller decision. And remember, and I know you get tired of hearing me say this, but because we keep having problems when people don't do this, make sure you have it documented. When the seller says, nope, I don't want you to tell anybody, we need to see that in an email. We need to see some kind of documentation, something in writing from that seller saying, here's the rule. Here's what we're going to do. You've got to have that, because if you just have an oral conversation, verbal conversation, their memory later when this deal goes south on them is going to be different than what they actually told you. So you need to work through that. So that's the first thing. The second thing that could be information to buyers is that it could just be that, yes, there are other offers. No other information, nothing about terms or anything, none of whether you've got 5 or 10 or 20 or some are above list price and some are at list price and some are low ball. Just the fact, all you can say is your seller said, okay, tell them there are other offers. That's all you get to tell them. It's your other offers. And that's it. We'll see further in this page where we'll talk about something in the code of ethics that deals with what else we tell them if we are going to tell them, yes, there are other offers, and we'll see that in just a minute. The third thing is it could be the existence of other offers and who the buyers are represented by if asked. And now further on this first page, you see, 5 little semi paragraphs there. And the second one it talks about something in the NAR Code of Ethics. In Article 1 of the NAR Code of Ethics, Standard of Practice 1-15, it has language that says if the listing agent has permission to disclose the existence of other offers, and if you're using, as you should be, the Texas Realtors Listing Agreement, in paragraph 11, seller has given us that permission to disclose the existence of other offers. So we already have that. So you have that permission to disclose the existence of other offers. So if a buyer's agent now asks you, okay, these other offers that you have, are they buyers working directly with you, the listing agent, in other words, a buyer customer, or are they buyers represented by another agent in your office, or are they a buyer represented by an agent in another company? If they ask you that under the NAR Code of Ethics, you have to answer. You're not going to give names. You're not going to say, oh, yeah, this is represented by Nancy and this is represented by, but you have to disclose, because a buyer competing with a buyer working directly with a listing agent, that other buyer could be at a significant disadvantage in negotiating an offer, because there could be different numbers, could be a variable commission, whatever's involved. So if you have that permission, and if you're asked, and only if you're asked, then you do have to give up that information. You do have to tell them that in working through the process. So that third thing is if they ask you, who are those other buyers represented by, then in fact, you do have to disclose that under the Code of Ethics. As we go through all these, if I come up with some things and you go, whoa, Bob, that's crazy. What are you smoking now? And you have a question or a comment or something, unmute yourself, let me know, raise your hand, do something like that, and let's deal with it. Okay?
I have a question, Bob.
Yes,
This is
ma'am.
Christina.
Question. Uh-huh.
If we do respond that it was somebody in our office that's bringing that other offer, do we then, because we've disclosed it to one, need to announce it to everyone?
No, good question. You only announce it, you only give that information if asked.
Okay.
So a buyer's agent has to ask for that information to get it. You don't just automatically put that out to all the other agents. Good question.
Thank you.
That makes sense? We good? Okay. So the fourth thing about buyers have the same level of information. This could include some or all of the terms of the competing offers. Now, here's our problem with this. The seller does have the authority to tell the listing agent, you know what? I want everybody to be on a level playing field, so I want you to tell everybody what the terms of an offer are. We highly discourage that because the reality is, the only way you could really give other people that full information is frankly to send out copies of the other offers to everybody. Because if you just give up the price, well, that's 1/3 of one paragraph, paragraph 3C. It doesn't have anything to do with closing date and title company and all the other information that could be important that's important on the criteria list. So the reality is we highly discourage it, and we explain to our seller, here's why we don't want to go down that road. Because when we start giving up some information, because a buyer's agent is going to ask, say, okay, we really love the property. We know it's a hot piece of property. We know you got other offers. We understand all of that. We just need to know, how high do we need to go here? Is list price going to work? Is 20,000 above list price going to work? Give us a hint here. Give us some help. We want to help your seller get the most they can get, and we want to help our buyer get the deal. So help us out here. Well, if all you're talking about is price, that's not enough. That doesn't cover the choice of the title policy, doesn't cover the choice of the title company, doesn't cover the choice of the cost on the survey, doesn't cover the closing date, doesn't cover whether it's temporary, seller's temporary lease. All these other things in the contract, none of them are touched on. And so just talking about the price is unfair to everyone. And we would never talk about just the price. We wouldn't talk about the price anyway without the seller's clear written instruction, and we would discourage it. We would discourage the seller from saying, yeah, let's at least give them the price. Because the seller might say, you know what? I've been there. I know how frustrating it is. I've been a buyer in this kind of situation, and they really helped me to get some additional information. And everybody here, if you've been in multiple offer situations and you represent a buyer, you have been amazed at the information you've been able to pull from a listing agent and shouldn't have gotten it. They've given up information. Go, really? Wow. Okay, so yeah, and you just keep pulling. Well, you can do that for your buyer, even when they give you information really probably shouldn't happen, and that happens. But you're not going to be that listing agent that gives up information that you don't have the authority from your seller to give up. And so you got to be very careful. So we're going to discourage our seller from letting us give any of the terms of an offer because it really works against everybody. We understand from the very beginning, even at that first step, when we tell a buyer's agent, yes, we have competing offers, one of the risks of that is it may run a buyer off. When buyers know they're in a competing situation and we say, he says, yeah, actually we do have another offer. Actually, in fact, we've got 10. Then the buyer's agent may say, wow, my buyer's not going to compete with that. They're willing to pay a fair price, but if they're battling, 9 other offers, we're going to lose them. They're just going to go somewhere else. So there's a risk when you begin to do that you could absolutely lose that buyer. That could absolutely happen. But the seller says, okay, that's a risk I'm willing to take. I think people need to know they're in a competing offer so that I only have serious buyers who are willing to step up and do a good deal. But every piece of information that we give out has a risk associated with it. We need to be aware of that risk. We need to be able to deal with it. As we go through a transaction, a multiple offer transaction, we have to recognize there's something that's not in the material, and that's something that's really not in the rules. It's only kind of implied with one of my last statements here about being nice. A multiple offer situation can be a very emotional, sensitive situation. We need to be receptive to that. As a listing agent, we need to be receptive to the fact that we've got buyers who are just chomping at the bits and about to have a hissy fit and about to have to take some more Valium or something to keep calm because they just can't stand not knowing, and they just get all excited, all upset. And we have to be sensitive to that, and we have to really help out by really being effective communicators and keep everybody up without giving up anything we shouldn't give up. We need to help everybody be on board with the timing, what's going to happen, when the seller's going to do something, and work through that. And so we actually need to be very careful and be sensitive to that. Some agents you're going to have to work harder at being sensitive with. Others, it's not a problem because they're very professional and just click, click, pop, pop, pop. They understand all the rules and understand what's going on, and they'll be easier to deal with. But some, I mean, you almost feel like you've taken them on to raise them because they need a lot of hand holding. And doing that will help you because real estate's a very small world. And this buyer's agent that you just screwed around could be the listing agent on that next deal that your buyer wants to buy. So we need to be very receptive, very helpful, not because it's just the right thing to do, but because it can really make a difference on your next deal as you kind of work through that. So everybody good with the 4 things in the first rule? Let's look at the second rule. And rule may be too strong a thing. Maybe better to think it was kind of like guidelines as opposed to actual laws or anything. But rule number 2 is no buyer can have a significant advantage over competing buyers. This kind of rolls a little bit back to rule 1, and they all need to have the same information. Now, having said that, any buyer is at an inherent advantage or disadvantage with other buyers just because of the nature of their offer. How much they're offering, what the terms are, who the agent is, who the title company is, who the lender is, all those kinds of things. But we don't want them to be at an advantage or disadvantage because the listing agent has taken a shine to them and is really helping them out. We have this happen especially when the listing agent and the buyer's agent really know each other. In fact, they're good friends. They may be in the same office. They may not be in the same office, but they could be long-time acquaintances in the business. And the listing agent, really respects the buyer's agent and really wants to help the buyer's agent get this deal. We understand those emotions, those things happen. We just have to make sure that we don't do anything that puts someone at a significant advantage over someone else for reasons that don't roll back to the merit of an offer. So we've got to be very careful as we do that. Now, rule number 3, all disclosures regarding offers must be authorized by the seller. Now, we kind of talked about it a little bit earlier. The authorization by the seller, part of that comes from terms in the listing agreement. Part of it comes from what the seller wants you to do, but all of it comes after you've advised them. You need to advise your seller. You need to say, okay, you get to make that decision. You are, in fact, the seller. You're the client, you're the decision maker. Here are the different sides to this. Here are the pluses and minuses of this. Here's why this is good and why it's not good. Here are your risk. We'll see this later when we talk about seller making a decision of how long he's going to consider offers and when he's going to make a decision to counter or accept and so forth. We'll understand their risk in waiting too long, moving too soon, and we'll advise them on those kinds of things. So we need to make sure. Now, under Rule 3, I've got several things here. One, I talk about the fact the listing agreement, you've got certain authorization in paragraph 11. And then I talked about the Code of Ethics, which we talked about earlier. The other is Article 3 of the Code of Ethics and Standards of Practice 3-4 talks about a variable commission. And we see a scenario later that we look at, but a variable commission in MLS, you're the listing agent, and on the same line in MLS where you see SAC, BAC, VAR. VAR means variable commission. And if you, the listing agent, have a negotiation with a seller where depending on what you have to pay out to a buyer's agent, the seller may owe you something differently. Now, this will only happen because a seller brings it up. Just like in a listing presentation, you're not going to say to the seller, okay, here's my standard policy. I always charge 6%. Unless, of course, you're able to negotiate a lower percentage with me. So you're not going to have that conversation. You're not going to help them out there. However, let's say that the seller says to you, says, okay, I understand I'm going to pay you X percent, 6%, and you're going to pay half of that. You're going to pay 3% out to a buyer's agent. And that's standard. That's what's in the industry. And the seller says, I understand that's how that works. And then the seller, because he's been around the park a couple of times, is kind of smart, says, Bob, tell me, if you don't have to pay the other side, if the buyer is representing themselves and you don't have to pay 3%, are you still going to get that whole 6%, or can we work something out here? Well, if you work something out where you say, okay, yeah, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll reduce that 6 down to 5 so that you've got a better net. And it works out good for everybody, and because I don't have to pay the other side. And the reason I'm not going to reduce it entirely, Mr. Seller, if I'm dealing with an unrepresented buyer, one, it's more work. Every time they need to see the property, that's me, because they don't have a key card, they can get into the property. Plus, I have more liability. I'm dealing directly with an unrepresented principal. I have more liability. So I'm not willing to give up the whole thing, but we'll work something out. So if you have that agreement in the original listing agreement, and only if you have it in the listing agreement, then when a buyer's agent, when you see an MLS, VAR, you'll put yes. And a buyer's agent's responsibility is then ask you, what's the variance? And my example was 1%, because this other buyer, in competing with the buyer who you don't have to pay a commission to, that buyer is at a 1% disadvantage in negotiating an offer. And so it's important for them to know that. So if you have that worked out in the listing agreement, then you need to make sure you've got that in MLS and you're prepared to disclose the percentage if and only if you're asked. The buyer's agent has to take the responsibility of asking you that. Any questions on the variable commission situation? We good with that? Now, the next thing, I really shouldn't have to say this, but I've had too many times in which I've had to say it. We don't have a multiple offer situation until you have received more than one offer. Not a phone call, hey, got it off? You got a contract? Yes. I'm on my way over. I got it right here. But you don't have it yet. Well, you're not in a multiple offer situation. Now, one of the things that we would want, and we actually talk about it in some of our stuff later, if you've got a piece of property, you can do it on any property, but especially if you've got about to take a listing. And 99% of the time, if this is a hot piece of property. I mean, you know it's going to have a lot of interest. You may have already, even before you put the sign out, have already had a lot of interest. So you know that. So here's the conversation you need to have with your seller. Seller, not only do we receive written offers, we get phone calls, we get emails, we get text. And what I want you, the seller, to tell me, the listing agent, is that you will only entertain offers that are in writing on a TREC form signed by a buyer. Anything else, you don't even want to hear about it. I need for you to authorize that. We can either put it as in special provisions of a listing agreement. You can put it in an email. You can say, yeah, here's the instruction. And you can say, yeah, I don't even want to hear about it unless. You want that authorization. So when a buyer's agent calls you up on your nice little $400,000 listing, and the buyer's agent says, Bob, that's a nice property. That's really good. My buyer would like to offer your seller $390,000. Well, technically that's an offer. And you have to call your seller and tell them about that. Except you have authorization from your seller to not call them and not tell them about that, and only call them about written offers, TREC forms signed by the buyer. And you have that authorization to tell that buyer's agent that. So and you'll do it in a nice way. You say, you know what? That's great. I'm really happy you've got a buyer interested in my listing. Here's what my seller has told me. Here's the instruction from my seller. They won't even know about your buyer's offer. And I own up, it's an offer. But my seller said they'll only entertain offers in writing, TREC forms, signed by the buyer. So you need to let your buyer know if they're really interested, 390, 380, 400, 400, whatever it is, here's how we need to see it in order to, for our seller to even know about the offer. So you need to do that. Otherwise, they will drive you nuts on a hot piece of property from investors and all those people. You'll get emails, you'll get phone calls, you'll get little letters and stuff that aren't on a TREC form, inquiring, asking about it. So you need to, help your seller needs to help you. So you're only going to entertain real offers. Now that's not a bad practice to make, by the way, on any property, except if you've got a property that's a hard sell and has been sitting on the market for 6 months and you've never had an offer, and all of a sudden you get the phone call, you're going to entertain that phone call because you don't have a line out the door of people wanting to buy that house. But if you're in a multiple offer situation, you in fact want to work through the process and make sure we'll have a good situation. Question on this before we go into our next page and go to our scenarios. Everybody good? Okay. Scenario number 1. Saturday morning, 9 o'clock, you're the listing agent, you receive an offer, and let's just presume it's correct like it's supposed to be. And so you contact the seller and say, okay, I've got an offer. Seller says, okay, let's get together tonight and let's look at this offer and any other offers that come in during the day. And seller says, and you have my permission to tell any buyer's agent when they come in with other offers that, yeah, we're going to get together tonight and look at all the offers. So Saturday morning, you get that offer. So at 10 o'clock, you receive an inquiry from another agent who asks you if there are any other offers. Got any other offers working? And because you have that permission, you're going to let them know, says, yeah, we do have. Now, at 11 o'clock, the listing agent receives a written offer from the second agent. Now, this is a $200,000 listing. The first offer was $195,000, and the second offer is for $200,000. Everybody good with the numbers? Now, when the first buyer made the offer, they were not in a competing offer situation. Everybody good? When the second buyer made an offer, they knew there was already an offer on the table. They knew there was already an offer, and so they made a little bit higher offer. They made a full list price offer. So the question becomes, what do we need to do? And remember, what we need to do is with authorization, permission from the seller. But it would seem in this situation that we need to call this first buyer's agent up and say, you're now in a competing offer situation. Would your buyer like to improve their offer? Now, the seller needs to know the risk of this is we could lose this first buyer. First buyer said, wow, I don't want to be in a competing offer situation. It's not fair. It's not reasonable. I made an offer and I'm a little disappointed that it didn't get accepted. I've got to fight the battle now. We could lose the buyer, or we could end up with a better offer. We don't know which, but it's correct and it's fair for us to advise the seller and say, yeah, we do need to let this first buyer know they're in a competing offer situation, encourage them to come in with another better offer. So when we look at things tonight, they've sent us their best deal. So is everybody good with that so far? Before we go into the second scenario, let's change up the numbers. Still $200,000 listing. First offer was for $200,000. Remember, first offer, no other offers existed. Second offer, knowing they were in a competing offer situation, offered $195,000. Not the brightest thing in the world, but hey, people do what they do, So under those circumstances, do we still need to call that first buyer up and say, when you made your offer, not a competing offer situation, however you are now, what would you like to do? Do we still need to call that first buyer up? What do you think?
I think yes.
Okay, so Sally Bartz thinks we should. Why do you think we should, Sally?
Because everybody has to have the same information, and otherwise I'm making a decision for my client about.
Well,
where they
you're
want.
not gonna do it or not do it except with your seller's authorization. You're gonna be in a conversation with your seller, and we look at the rules and go through this. One of the things we talk about is one buyer having a significant advantage over another buyer.
Mhm.
So look at the numbers here. Is the first buyer at a disadvantage in competing with the second buyer, presuming everything else in the offer is reasonably the same?
Sure,
Is
because
this-
they don't know that there's
No,
another.
but the first buyer made a full price offer, 200,000. Second buyer made an offer at 195. Is the first buyer at a disadvantage in competing with the second buyer?
Not
First
on
buyer made a
price.
full price offer.
Not on
Second
price.
buyer made less than full price.
Well, not on price, Bob.
No,
But-
I'm saying presuming everything else in the offer is the same, we got to do that for the exercise. So if the price is the only difference for the seller, is this first buyer at a disadvantage in competing with the second buyer? See, I don't think they are,
No,
because they've made an offer that's better than the second offer, and the second offer knew they were in a competing offer situation, did make the best offer. First buyer did make a best offer. So here's your big risk with the first buyer. They made a great offer. In fact, they may have made an offer that unless something else comes in much, much better that day, seller's going to be pretty predisposed to say, wow, and I like that. But the reality is, as you look at this, if we go back to that first buyer and say, you know what, you're now in a competing offer situation, first buyer's going to think, wow, we made a full price offer, and now they're putting pressure on us to go above that because we're in a competing offer situation. We could well run that first buyer off who'd made a really good offer to our seller. That's not a good risk to take. Do you see that? Does that
Yep.
make semi-sense?
but doesn't the client get to make that decision?
Absolutely. All the way through this, Sally, all the way through this. The client is part of the conversation. The client is the decision maker. We absolutely, before we decide to call or not call the first agent back, we have the conversation with the seller. We explain the plus and the minus. And the seller says, you know what, I understand we can lose a buyer, but you've got a seller who's very aggressive and just wants to go for every penny. He says, call them up, push them, push them, push them. Seller gets to make that decision. There's no question seller's going to be decision maker. But the seller sits there and goes, wow, I really like that first offer. I like everything about it, especially the price. I really would rather not lose them. Let's don't call them. Seller gets to make that decision. Is everybody good with that decision?
Yep.
Can be made by
Yes.
the seller?
Bob, I have
Yeah.
a question on
Yes,
that
ma'am, question.
scenario.
Yeah.
Should we then, if the seller becomes very aggressive and tries to go for gold, should we then get that authorization in writing from the seller that he has instructed us to announce a multiple offer situation?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I like documentation. You know how I am about that. So when you have that conversation with the seller and seller says, yeah, go and call that first agent, then you'll do an email where they acknowledge you've advised them of the risk of doing that, the pros and the cons, and they've made the decision. So you've got that documentation, because later when the deal goes south, people's memories tend to fade. They go, I don't remember telling you that. Where'd that come from? You're making stuff up now, Bob. And I said, well, yeah, I am, but I just thought I'd get away with it, work through that. So does everybody have a good sense of kind of what works in these different scenarios? And keep in mind, as Sally Bartz pointed out, we always have our client in the middle of every conversation. And like Christina brought up, we want documentation on whatever their decision is. We need to have that backed up, because otherwise we get all kinds of challenges in working through that because there is a risk there. And we've followed that up with, we go to the third page, the seller has the authority to instruct the listing agent to disclose the existence of multiple offers. So we've got some scenarios here, and we've got multiple offers, and you've got the situation which you can kind of read through, and I've got a question on you because you've got 4 written offers. One of the things you need to keep in the back of your mind, once you get into a multiple offer situation, 3 offers, 5 offers, 10 offers, whatever it might be, you've got to be sensitive to the fact that this is, on the one hand, wow, this is great news. Boy, my seller is going to just really make out like a bandit. At the same time, it's bad news because it's hard. It's hard for a seller to choose which offer. And when the seller chooses an offer, one of the big things the seller is deciding is, I think this offer has the best chance of going to closing. And we know as agents, there are no guarantees here. Not all deals close. And we understand that. But our seller is really relying on, they've made a really good decision. And not only does this give them a good net and everything is great, but it's most likely going to close. And that's hard. That's why we need to help our seller through with a good criteria list, which we talked about in our class earlier this month, and went through that, helping them come up and say, yeah, here's what can lead us to a judgment call, a total guess on which one is most likely to close. We just had this happen 2 months ago. Cash transaction, seller feeling really good about it. Going to close in 3 weeks, cash transaction. While still in the option period, within the first week of the transaction, the buyer changed from a cash transaction to financing. And we've had this conversation before on what happens if financing changes and contingencies and all that. But all of a sudden, this great offer that the seller accepted because they felt like it had the highest probability of closing wasn't any better than 2 other offers that they didn't accept. Those things happen. Now, you don't need to go to great lengths and talk about that because you'll have a seller, depending on their personality, who could just get overwhelmed and freeze up and not be able to make any decisions at all. So you want to be careful and use your judgment on how far you go explaining all this to them as they work through it. But so here you've got a situation, a scenario, you've got 4 offers and you're working through the process. You're going through it. You've got a 5th offer, full price, cash off, very attractive terms. And you've already scheduled with the seller a meeting later that day to go over all the offers. And upon receipt of the last really good offer, and the listing agent contacts them that information. So we had 4 offers. We've got a 5th offer, great offer, cash, quick closing, all those kinds of things. So our first question, we've gone through the process, disclosing multiple offers, and the seller is saying, needs your final and best offer. And they're saying, here's the concept. Tonight, we're going to get together and we'll look at continue to submit offers. We'll look at offers till 5 p.m. today, whatever the time frame is. Can the seller change their mind and go ahead and accept this 5th offer and not give all the other offers an attempt to come in with another final and best offer? Does the seller has the ability to do that? Or do they have to wait until that night and look at all the offers simultaneously and make a decision, make sure that everybody had their fair shot at coming up with their best offer? Or can the seller say, we already told them final and best offer, so we can presume that whatever they've sent in is their best? Has the seller have a right to shortcut the process and go ahead and take that last offer? What do you think, guys?
100%.
Absolutely, Terry, 100%. Seller is in total control and gets to make that decision. They don't have to wait. Whatever time frame they may have dealt with, they could shortcut it and say, here's the deal. And so they have to make sure they go in that situation, and then the seller has to give their agent the instructions to tell the other buyer's agents, hey, here's what my seller has done. And by the way, my seller would encourage backup offers. You've got to be prepared to deal with some unhappy buyer's agent because they won't understand that this could happen. A good buyer's agent, by the way, when you're representing a buyer, and we'll see this a little bit later in this, when you're representing a buyer and you're given this information from a listing agent, the agent says, okay, multiple offers, be sure and come on your final and best. I'm going to get together with the seller tonight at 8 o'clock. He's going to look at all the offers. As a good buyer's agent, you say to your buyer, okay, here's where we are with this. Here's what we're hoping will happen. But you need to know at any point in time from now until when the seller finally does something, another offer can come in and buy it right out from under us. And that's what could happen. So that when it does happen, your seller is not ready to hang you. I mean, your buyer's not ready to hang you because they'll be furious. Whoa, 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 this can't happen. They've got to give us another chance. Well, no, they don't. They don't have to do that at all. You should work through that. So as we work through it, so are we good with that? Questions on that? Seller does have a right to accept it. They're not required to give other buyers the opportunity as you work through it. And when the buyers find out their offer wasn't done, they're going to be mad at you and working through it. And remember, we want to try to keep in some way, shape, or form something really good about this and make sure they do it. And by the way, when your seller decides to go ahead and do this, and this doesn't happen too often, it happens often enough that we had to at least settle to keep us from in a lawsuit. And it was a challenging situation anyway because we had too many attorneys involved. The buyer was an attorney, the buyer's agent was an attorney, and all kinds of messes. But it doesn't happen that often. Most of the time, when a really great offer comes in and the seller's already set up something with a listing agent to get together that night, and the seller says, wow, man, I don't think we should take a chance of losing this one. Unless there's something else going on, and the something else that's going on may be a relocation trip, and the buyer said, you know what? I understand you've got a timeline here that you've got to work with, but so do we. This is our last trip for our relocation. We've got to make a decision today. There's another property we really like, but we like yours the best. But we've got to know within a very reasonable time frame what you might do with this. There are sometimes situations in which you've got a time-sensitive situation, but most of the time, you're going to advise your seller, says, you know what? Let's go ahead and wait tonight so we can pull together all the information and give me that opportunity to ask all the questions of the buyer's agents that we'll see, we talk about in a little bit, and be able to go through that. We discourage the seller from doing this. There are a number of things the seller has the right to do that aren't necessarily the right thing to do. And we need to keep that in mind. Questions on that? We good? Okay, let's go to the next page. See on page 4, the question, to what degree does the listing agent's big picture understanding of everything play into the advice given to a seller on what to do in a multiple offer situation as described above? First of all, we need to be clear. I've talked about this before, but it's been a long, long time ago, 2 months ago, which seemed like a long time. Let's talk about the big picture. It's incredibly important. Even if you're a fairly new agent, you've got a big picture. And that big picture is your sense as a listing agent, what's going on in the entire market, in this neighborhood, with offers, with agents, with lenders. One of your big pictures is you need to know there are things going on with the lenders right now that are a real challenge. Lenders are having problems with personnel, keeping trained people. Lenders are having problems with doing a lot of refinancing and not being able to take care of purchase mortgages. We have a challenge with title companies. We have a challenge with inspectors, appraisers, timelines. Your big picture all comes into play as you advise your seller on looking at certain kinds of situation. Your sense of the criteria of all the things that are involved is critical. The more experienced you are, the bigger your big picture is. You need to have confidence. You need to rely on that sense of a big picture as you're up there at 30,000 feet looking down on the transaction. Your sense of everything that's going on is going to really help you with your client. One of the little things, by the way, and it's really not so little, part of your big picture is your judgment call on your client. The range of who we have out there is enormous. And you need to make as early as possible a judgment call on how your client makes decisions, how they process your information, how you're able to communicate with them. If you've got a client who just gets overwhelmed so easy in a heartbeat, you've got to take your whole process of communication much slower, much easier, step by step, almost talking slowly, almost spelling out words. And I don't mean to be condescending, but you've got to be really careful as you work through it. Whereas if you've got a client who is just pop and go, aggressive, and is very impatient, make quick and hard decisions, then you've got to communicate in a way that helps you with that. But also, you've got to be prepared to do a U-turn with some of those clients or sellers who are very aggressive, make quick decisions. Don't hang with those decisions. Don't stay committed to them. And you've already picked up that to tell you something right now, but 2 hours later, it's a whole different thing. Sometimes it's their personality. Sometimes it's their medication. There's no telling what it might be. So your big picture is incredibly important. And I have in there things that it includes. Don't minimize the importance of your big picture. It's one of the very important things. When you go out on a listing presentation, talk to sellers, your big picture understanding, not just your CMA, but your big picture understanding of what's going on in that market, in that neighborhood, and what's going on out there is really important. So really have a lot of confidence in that and working through it. So, working through and dealing with it. Another question on this page. What are the actions of the listing agent regarding the other agents in a multiple offer situation beyond just answering the question, is a seller working any other offers? We want to talk to them about some timing issues. When you're in a multiple offer situation, one of the decisions that your seller has to make, and we'll see this working through this, your seller has to decide how long they're going to accept offers. Part of that comes into what day of the week is it? If this just went on the market and it's a Monday, then you've got a different situation than if it just came on the market and it's a Friday. You may want to get through the weekend. You may want to wait and see what kind of offers come in Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. You want to have your seller is the decision maker. You want to have your seller understand the risk. If you have too long a time frame before the seller is going to say, okay, that's all the offers are going to come in, I'll make a decision now which one to counter or accept. If it's too long, you could lose your first buyers. Those first buyers who made an offer on Thursday may not be willing to wait on Sunday. In fact, they may be suspicious that you're working all this stuff against them, that they've made a good offer and they really want you to work it right now. And they're really impatient with the fact that you're using their offer against them. So the longer you wait, the longer time span, the more the risk. The flip side of that, if it's too short a time frame, property comes on the market Friday, morning, and the seller says, by noon Saturday, we're going to make a decision. Well, you're going to miss that perfect offer that comes in at 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon. So one of the things you'll want to do as a listing agent is you'll want to check showtime and you want to see what kind of showings are scheduled. Because if it just came on the market Friday morning and you already have scheduled for Saturday 10 showings, you don't want to make a decision noon on Saturday. You want to give a little bit more time for offers to come in and work through that process. So you want to be able to so you want to be able to have your seller make a decision, go through that process, communicate to a buyer's agent, hear the decisions, and continue that communication. I do want to ask a question of all of you. So when you communicate to buyer's agents that you're in a multiple offer, when you communicate to buyer's agent, here's a timeline, how are you doing that? Is it email? Is it Showtime? Is it MLS? Do you send, one of the things in your packet is a multiple offer form? Do you use something like that to send out to them? So we got 35 people on board here. Give me a little bit of a sense of how you communicate to buyer's agent what's going on here.
I have done it through the showing time and send it out to each of the people who has seen the property to make sure that anybody who might want to make an offer but hasn't presented has that opportunity as well.
Okay, makes sense. It's good. Anyone else on how you do it? I see several people, some in chat have talked about using showing time. And it could be good.
Typically what I do
Yes.
is, or
Go
typically
ahead,
what I
Terry.
do is like the first one, say I have an offer, I know it's gonna be multiple offers. I'll say we're not in multiple offers yet, you're the first one. And then after they start coming, I let the first one know that we're in multiple offers. And then every offer after that, I'll let them know from the beginning. So I really don't call highest and best. I let them know we're in multiple offers, just give me your best, but they end up doing it at the end anyway. You know what I'm saying? Like you get to say 6 o'clock on Sunday.
And how do you do that? So Terry, how do you do that? You make a phone call, do you email, or what?
It can be all three. Like we'll put it in showing time first. Sometimes we'll even put it in the MLS. So we'll put it in the MLS, let it know it's multiple offers. We also put it in showing time, and then we'll email every agent. And if they communicate with me, then I'll call them back. If they're not calling me, I'm not probably calling them.
Okay, good. Can everybody see me okay? I just saw a thing flash up on my screen, says your internet connection is unstable. Maybe that's a comment about me more than my internet connection.
Mm-hmm.
You what?
I said you look as beautiful as always.
What was that, Terry?
Pretty and pink.
Okay, well, good. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. Pretty and pink. Okay, good. So you know, does everybody agree that regardless of how you do it, it's important to communicate to them so that they do know the kind of situation they're in? Now, remember, all the way through this process, who are we keeping in the circle on all our communication? We're keeping our client, right? We're talking to seller and says, okay, seller, here, you know, hot piece of property, already got 2 offers, probably gonna have more. Here's how we're communicating. Here's what I'm saying. Here's how I'm doing this. Your seller needs to be on board with that. So you need to have your seller involved in those conversations all the way through the process. Everybody good with that?
Yep.
I've got a concept at the very bottom of this paper. We talked about this a few minutes earlier, and I want to be a little careful talking about this. It's the variable commission situation. Remember, that only comes up when your seller brings it up. But let's say we don't, because we don't know whether or not we might end up in a situation with an unrepresented buyer. So we've got a listing, we've got the normal, got 6% in it. And we're looking at 3 offers. And for the concept, for the exercise, they're all essentially the same. I mean, they're all the same price, they're the same terms. It's all terms acceptable to the seller, either the same terms or terms the seller, yeah, I'm good with that, I'm good with that, I'm good with that. And the seller said, wow, how do I decide? These are 3 great offers. And is there some way for us to work this out? As the listing agent, and remember, you have not yet in the listing agreement
Bob's frozen up.
Either that or that's a prayerful pause.
Well, Laura, I think you could teach the class now.
I'm thinking probably not, but he's dropped. He'll be back on, I think.
Yeah. I think we should all make up problems for him when he comes back and just kind of start shooting at him.
It wouldn't stump him.
You think he knows, Laura, that he's
I'm gonna
on?
ask Lori to text him real quick.
Yeah.
Okay, we've reached out to him. We'll see how fast he can get back on.
Everybody have me back again? Can you see me?
Yay!
We're good?
Yay.
Yes.
I had to have my other daughter, Jennifer, come in and get me reconnected. All of a sudden, I was totally disconnected, as it were, which happens to me a lot personally, but this was an internet thing. Okay. So we were talking about the variable commission situation. You did not have it in the original listing agreement, but you have a situation which the seller is trying to decide which of three offers and which are very equal. And one of the three offers is from a buyer who's representing themselves. And you went through that process and they're capable of representing themselves. And you don't have to pay a commission to that side. This buyer who's representing himself didn't ask for anything, didn't ask for any money, didn't ask for reduced price or anything. And so you can say to the seller, okay, on this buyer, I'll reduce the commission from 6 to 5%, which will give you a seller the better net. And if you accept this buyer's offer, you get a better net, and I still come out okay because I'll get 5 instead of 6, and we work through that. Your seller may negotiate and say, how about 4.5? And you may negotiate some number. But the concept is you can choose to reduce how much the seller owes you in the situation for that buyer who you don't have to pay to the other side. Now, the original in the listing agreement, that variable commission had to be disclosed, and you put it in MLS. When it happens after the fact like this, no disclosure is required. You don't have to tell anybody, here's why the seller took this offer over the other two offers because of that. Now, if a buyer's agent asks you, hey, the other buyers that are in multiple offers, who they're represented by, you can give them that information, but you don't have any variable commission disclosure to make in this scenario because it was not in the original listing agreement. It happened after the fact. And I know that's a fine line, but that's been addressed at the NAR manual at the very highest level. And that is, in fact, how that works. You work through it. So any questions on that? Okay. On page 5, it just talks about that particular situation we just talked about. Now, let's look at some things from the buyer's perspective. Going to page 6 in the multiple offers. Any follow-up questions from the seller side as we're working through all that? So the first question I have, and we kind of talked about this earlier, should the buyer's agent generally presume in today's market there either are or will be multiple offers? What do you think? Any ideas?
It depends.
It depends. What does it depend on?
Price, condition of the property, days on the market, but I think you would be wise to educate your buyer to the very real possibility of multiple offers on some properties
Yeah.
if they haven't figured it out already.
Okay. And so Laura's right. In this situation we're talking about, you're going to make judgment calls based on what's going on with the property. And some properties you just automatically say, hey, yeah, we're going to have it. And so you automatically start educating your buyer on the multiple offer scenario. You got a nice little $200,000 listing, 1 story in Frisco. Really? Okay. So, but here's the other side of this. Here's what you have to be prepared for. And this happens far more often than we think. $850,000 listing, been sitting on the market for 5 months, not offer 1, and all of a sudden there are 3. There's something in the ether out there. There's something that when an offer comes in, and remember, offers, they're not public. Nobody else knows there's an offer. So an offer comes in, and then another offer comes in, another offer comes in. That happens on a regular basis. So you need to be prepared as soon as something like that happens to very quickly make an adjustment and educate your buyer on here's what we do in multiple offer. I mean, you got a piece of property, your buyer made the original offer knowing, hey, this property has been on the market for 6 months, no offers. I bet I can negotiate a really good deal. So your buyer makes on this nice $850,000 listing, they make an $800,000 offer, even though your CMA supports 850 or 840, maybe 830, but your buyer made a low offer. And that's not unusual. You do that, and then all of a sudden you find you're competing. Your buyer needs to be willing to adjust. By the way, when this happens, your knowledge of what's going on in this transaction, your knowledge of the other agent becomes important, because your buyer will automatically become suspicious. Really? It's been sitting there 6 months, and you're telling me now all of a sudden there's another offer? Is that even real? Or are you just trying to create a sense of urgency? You're just trying to create a competitive situation. Certainly that kind of thing happens, but don't let your buyer go down the suspicious road. Laura, do you have something on that?
Bob, this is Christina. I have a thought
Christina.
on that too. If you're getting ready to show the property and it's been on the market 6 months, but you are aware that it has just had a price reduction, I think then you still warn them that even though it's been on the market, there's been an adjustment or an improvement in price, and it may go into multiple offers.
Oh, absolutely. One of the reasons it may have been on the market for so long, it was way overpriced. The seller just couldn't be convinced to come down to the market price. Other situations that can happen. One of our agents had the buyer on a property, and it had been on the market for almost a year. And the buyer's actual reaction on this was, what's wrong with the property? Well, why has nobody else bought this property? Why are we even going to, take the risk of buying a property that nobody else wants and been sitting there for a year? Well, fortunately, our agent knew the listing agent. And then the listing agent was, receptive of giving up a lot of information. And so the listing agent said, well, here's why it's been on the market for a year. First of all, it started off at way too high a price. Plus the seller, a gentleman, he's a widower by himself. And the house was incredibly cluttered. Just all kinds of stuff in it. It did not show well at all. In fact, showed terrible. overpriced and had a bad roof, needed a new roof. And the seller just wasn't willing to put on a new roof, wasn't willing to come down in price until almost a year later. And so the buyer said, okay, I understand now what's going on with this. I understand why it's been on the market. And now it's the price has been reduced. It's been cleaned up. It's no longer cluttered. It shows well. It's got a new roof on it. And buyer said, this is a good deal now. And it was. And so the buyer made a good, reasonable offer. Fortunately, the buyer moved quickly enough to get it, because no sooner did the buyer end up in a contract that all of a sudden other offers showed up at that new reduced price and the new condition. So there sometimes are reasons why a property will sit there for a long period of time, and a buyer needs to understand to be educated and working through that. But you need to understand the kind of things out there that are cause a property to sit there for some period of time. And depending on the price range, if you're at $1,250,000, if you're $2,500,000, you don't expect it to sell in a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It's going to be a longer time frame. The right buyer for that property may take 6 months to get there. And, that's just the nature of what happens. So, so now there are, my question here, if the answer is yes, and it is yes, what questions should the buyer's agent ask before submitting an offer, other than are there competing offers? What does a buyer's agent, a good buyer's agent, want to know when they're making an offer on a good piece of property? Aside from they want to know if there are other offers, what else might a buyer's agent want to know from a listing agent?
Try to learn the seller's motivation.
Yeah, why are they selling? To find out, if this is a good reason for them selling, it's a good situation, good motivation. What's going on with them. That's an important thing to know about the seller.
Do they need a lease back?
Yeah, do they need a lease back? Do they need something towards the end? One of the things that happens, especially in multiple offers, is lease backs have almost become automatic. Like it's no big deal. Well, a buyer needs to understand, while they may have to give up a lease back, there are risks. And a buyer needs to understand there are risks in giving a seller a lease back, and they need to make sure that they, in fact, have talked to their insurance agent and go through that process. So wanting to know if they need a lease back. Yep. Something else? I hear other people.
Hey, Bob,
What
just
else do we need to
general,
know?
what's important to the seller?
What's net? Yeah, what is important? Is it all net? Is that important? Is it the closing date? Is it possession? What's really key to this seller? The seller wants something that's quick and easy. And part of this will come from, and you should know this if you've shown the property, if it's occupied or vacant, those things will come into play. So you do want to know what's important to the seller. Absolutely correct. What else? So Larry, does Marcia have anything? Is she
wants
not
to start
even
with
there?
Water.
I am there.
Hello, Marcia. So do you have anything, Marcia? Certainly you have some very astute and appropriate questions. You say, oh, here's what I always ask the seller. I always ask them this. What do you think, Marcia?
I think you're doing a great job, Bob. And
Even
so
finally getting the internet back.
happy that Larry can join in and answer these questions because he's in training. So that's good.
Well, you know what? And it's good to have him in training. And it's good that he's got good mentors like you to help him through this and ask all these great questions. So good job. And glad to have you on there as you work through it. Anything else we should be asking a listing agent?
I have asked, I don't know if I was supposed to, but I did ask them. I said I was looking at the property history and I was really concerned. I couldn't figure it out because the price went up, then it went down, then it was off the market, then it was back on the market, then it was off, and then it was back on again.
So Sally, what you're basically saying is what's going on with the seller?
Like this doesn't make sense. And then I said, is there something wrong with the records in MLS? What?
Yeah.
And she said, no, they're in the middle of a divorce and they're having an argument about how much to list the property for.
Yep. And see, that gets back to one of the things that was mentioned earlier, what's important to the seller, motivation of the seller. If they're in a divorce situation, whole different ball game. You'll already know if it's an estate situation. All those things are factors. anytime you have anyone other than that seller involved in making decisions, you got a court involved, you got a trustee involved, you've got a beneficiary involved, you've got an executor, anything, you've got a court who's going to do a final divorce decree. If you've got a divorce situation and there's only one of the soon-to-be ex-spouses living in the property, you really need to know how they feel about the sale, because they can so just put a kilter in that thing in a heartbeat. So you really need to know, kind of with Sally's question, what's going on with the seller. And in a divorce situation, off and on. Well, the challenge is your buyer gets into a contract with these sellers, and your buyer is spending time, energy, and money, option fee, inspection fee, appraisal, all those kinds of things. And then the seller all of a sudden decides, oh, we decided we're not going to sell after all. We've gotten back together. We're not going to divorce. And the reason we get back together is we love this house. And so we're not going to sell. Oops. And your buyer's just going through this whole process and dealing with that. So, you've got to ask questions and find out what's going on with the seller. We just had a situation, and I don't have any way of asking this question. Fortunately, our agent knew it was one in our Rockwall office, and it was a divorce situation, but the soon-to-be ex-wife had a restraining order against the seller. Against the husband, the ex-husband. In fact, he had already been to jail once for assaulting her. Well, it's kind of important for you to know that's what's going on with those fine folks, because that certainly could affect what happens and whether you can get this closed or not. So you need to ask those kinds of questions and really find out about it. So question in the middle of this, page 6, what can the buyer do in a multiple offer or potential multiple offer situation to make your offer more attractive to a seller other than sales price? We understand sales price tends to be what a seller looks at. They go right to paragraph 3C. How much do they offer me? They forget to go to paragraph 12A1B, see how much seller concession the buyer is asking for, and ask for also who's going to pay the title policy and other things. So when you're going through this process, consider the choices that are made in following paragraphs that could make a difference to the seller. Paragraph 2D, exclusions. Maybe the seller has already indicated in MLS that they want to exclude that custom chandelier in the formal dining room. Well, the buyer needs to know about that and needs to be okay with that. Down payment, loan amount. Most sellers will view a larger down payment as a more qualified buyer. Certainly not true, not real, but many sellers look at that, just like sellers often look at the amount of the earnest money as telling whether or not this really is a good qualified buyer or not. You understand that's really not the case, that there are other things involved. Flip over to page 7, paragraph 6D, objections. Don't let your buyer stick a weasel clause in that paragraph, that objections paragraph. It needs to be something real, otherwise it really clouds the offer. If the buyer says, I'm only going to buy this house because it's got a big backyard, I want to build an in-ground pool, and so if I can't build an in-ground pool because of easements, I get to object. That's a real thing. But if the buyer says, well, we want to make sure that we can run a home business out of the house, well, that creates all kinds of problems for a potential seller. So you want to make sure any objections you stick in there make good sense as you work through it. Seller disclosure notice. If you've got the buyer and you're in a multiple offer, about to be multiple offer situation, and the listing agent has downloaded or uploaded the seller disclosure notice in MLS, by gosh, go ahead and pull it down. Go ahead and have it. And the offer, go ahead and check off 7B1 showing the buyer has it. Don't play that stupid game. Well, technically, they haven't delivered it, so my buyer doesn't have it, so I'm going to check off 7B2. Well, the seller may well take another offer where they've pulled it down and checked off 7B1, which made it a better offer. Because remember 7B2, that's a 7-day right of termination. That's as strong as the option period. So you want to really make sure as you go through that. 7D1, dealing with the as-is provision, specific repairs and treatments. Don't let your buyer stick anything in there that's not real. My gosh, in a multiple offer situation, don't put $600 in there for a home warranty. Live with that. Closing date. Now, this is where we get into some of the challenges. Closing date, possession date, sell temporary lease, all those kinds of things. One of the things that you have to warn your buyer, and we talk about it a little bit later, all these things you're discovering about the seller, what works with the seller, that you're telling your buyer. If you don't have the conversation, your buyer may think you stepped over to the dark side and you're trying to create an offer to the benefit of the seller. You're no longer an advocate for the buyer. You need to help the buyer understand the reason we're doing this is to improve your offer. I'm still your advocate, and you should say that. I'm your advocate. I'm doing this all for you. Nothing in what we're doing should be against it. If there's anything in here that you're not good with, we won't offer it. We won't do it. But you've got to warn them, or they'll say, my gosh, Bob, everything you talk about is seller, seller, seller. Am I somewhere in this equation? No, I'm not your client. So you've got to really offer them and let them know, here's the situation. So questions so far on that? Things you need to look for? Page 8, multiple offers from the seller's perspective. In a multiple offer situation, what are the paragraphs to pay special attention to in the offer and why? One of the first things that your seller is going to look at is paragraph 3. They're going to look at the sales price, and they're also going to look at 3A and 3B. They're going to look at the loan amount. They're going to look at the down payment. You need to have that conversation with your seller and help them understand if they're putting too much emphasis on that or not. If this buyer makes what looks like an attractive offer, everything else offer is looking good, and in paragraph 3, on a $400,000 listing, the buyer puts $200,000 down, getting a loan for $200,000. So I say, wow, man, that's a strong buyer. I really like that. Well, one thing a good listing agent will certainly do is get proof of funds for that $200,000 down. Now, it's amazing how few listing agents really think to verify the down payment, even a large down payment. But here they went through the process, did or maybe didn't do it. But there's nothing that keeps the buyer from closing with 5% down. The buyer doesn't have to close with $200,000 down. And so the seller needs to understand, this thing that the buyer may put in there. This is one of the things I talk about in that other class we'll probably do sometime this next year called dirty tricks. Dirty tricks of negotiating. And the concept of dirty tricks is not to learn them so you can use them, but to learn them so you know when they're being used against you. Because sometimes they are. So paragraph 3 can be a paragraph that really can create a little bit of a challenge as you work through that. So pay attention to it. The other thing is looking at paragraph 7B, and you've got the contract in your package there. Paragraph 7B and paragraph 23. And you look at paragraph 7B 2, and we just talked about this a few minutes ago. The buyer has made an offer, and in paragraph 23, no option period, no option fee. But 7B2 is checked off. And a listing agent who hadn't been around the park a couple of times, who hasn't been trained, may say to the seller, wow, this is a great offer. He's not even looking for an automatic right to terminate. He didn't even check off paragraph 23. So he's committed. That's a committed buyer. This is great. But the buyer has a 7-day free option period with 7B2. And if it's in a mandatory HOA and A1 is checked off, the buyer's got a minimum of a 3-day option period to terminate for any reason. So we need to know when those things are pulled in there, the seller needs to not put unreasonable amount of importance on something like, no option period or an option period there or whatever. You need to be able to work through that and say, wow, you got to look for those kinds of things that can make a difference. We also sometimes look at the closing date. I mean, closing date and possession date can be very important to a seller. And the reality is these are reasonable time contracts. And if your seller has a critical situation where if they don't close on this date, they're in big trouble on the next house they're buying, they need to make sure they understand as a reasonable time contract, it may not close on that day, but it may close 2 or 3 days later, and that's okay. Reasonable time contracts. And that could create a real challenge as you go through that situation. So we want to be very careful as you work through it to not put too much importance. You need to be aware of your seller's circumstance and know what really is important. How much you're putting down, the loan amount, not that big a deal. Possession and closing date can be a very big deal for your seller because your seller may be about to become homeless if they don't have a good possession situation or don't have a good seller's temporary residential lease that they can work through and deal with that.
And Bob, isn't that something that ultimately could make your offer look better than the next offer if you're taking into consideration and the agent asks in advance, what are their needs as far as a closing time?
Absolutely. Absolutely correct. You need to go through that and deal with that. And it becomes a very valuable thing, a very important thing. As I continue through with this, and it's a good question, Christina, and it's still on page 8. In addition, the terms of the offer is set forth in contract form. What other information does the seller need to know in comparing different offers and determining which offer benefits the seller the most? You know, we look at things like the net. We look at things like the certainty of close. And one of the things, and we talked about this in the last class, and some of the other things, is questions that you need to ask of every buyer. As a listing agent, there are certain questions that you need to ask of every buyer. One, you need to know if this buyer has a house to sell. They are not required to tell the seller. They can't lie about it, but they're not required to tell it. And not all pre-qual letters, not all lenders address it. So you need to ask that question. You need to point blank ask that question to the buyer's agent. Also, is the buyer on other offers right now? Do they have other offers out? In and of itself, that's not a killer because in this market, one of the challenges with buyers with the limited inventory out there is they may well be in multiple offers on different properties because they just say, you know what, we're desperate. We got to find something. This one's close. This one's close. Okay, let's just make 2 offers, maybe 3 offers. Well, we'd kind of like to know that. We'd especially like to know not if they're just in other offers, are they in other contracts? Buyer can be in multiple contracts, and frankly, the only risk they have is the option fee, as long as they pay attention to the time frame. We'd also like to know if this buyer has terminated any other contracts recently. One of our good agents, fairly new agent, less than a year, had a challenge with a buyer. And when she called me and we were talking about it, and in the conversation, she said, I'm not sure what to do with this buyer. They just terminated a contract. Appropriately, they did it during the option period. But this is the 3rd time. This is the 3rd contract they've terminated. Well, that buyer's agent called me. The buyer's agent said, you know, what do I do with these buyers? They keep terminating contracts. Well, you've got to make a judgment call. Is this a buyer who's just not willing to ever make a commitment? Is this a buyer who keeps going for the perfect house, not ever going to make a decision? If you think that's the case on any level, you cannot afford to take the time, energy, and money and represent that buyer. You've got to move on. But as a listing agent, I'd like to know, buyer, did you just terminate another contract? If so, why? You know, what's going on there? Is there something happening? Well, yeah, we terminated because we didn't think we could buy it because we're going to get divorced, but now we're not going to get divorced. We're back together again. We're in counseling. So now we're ready to buy. And so we'll work through that. The other thing is we'd like to know if the buyer has physically visited the property. That's not huge. There are reasons why they haven't. They're out of town. It's a trailing spouse. But there's a risk there. Even with investors, a lot of investors out there make a lot of offers to get into a contract. And the first time they see the property during the option period, many of these investors go away in a heartbeat. They do their numbers, they walk through the process, through the property, and they come up with some ideas. And then you go, wow, man. So these investors who don't see the property before they get into a contract, those are risky investors. If you've got a buyer who just hadn't seen the property yet, and as people move in from out of state, that certainly happens, it is a risk, and we need to know that. So you've got to be asking, as a listing agent, you've got to be asking those kinds of questions of every buyer. And by the way, every buyer, if you pick and choose, you may be guilty of discriminating. So you need to be able to work through and deal with that in a fair and reasonable manner. Okay, look on page 9, question at the top. What are the critical red flags the agent must point out as the seller evaluates any offers? One, anything financial, you've got to verify it. You've got to confirm, their financial situations. Sometimes a buyer makes an offer that frankly looks a little too perfect. I know that seems crazy because the buyer's going to want to make a really attractive offer, but you're going, wow, man, can I really believe all of that? Is all that really okay and really good as we work through that? Sometimes you find yourself, I don't know. But as you go through, make sure you verify everything. Title companies are important. You really want one of the major retail title companies. One of the challenges we have with investors is they use these title companies that are focused on investors, and service with those title companies often is a great challenge because they're very committed to the investor who brings them a lot of business. And they do some things for them that sometimes creates a big challenge. So we want to be careful as we work through that. We want to look for red flags. If we've got financing and we've only got one person in the contract, we need to make sure that's all the lender's going to require is that one person to be able to qualify for the loan, be able to close the deal. Depending on the type of financing, it may well be that there's a husband and wife, but the wife is the one with the good credit and the money. And in fact, the lender says, we really don't even want the husband on the deal because he doesn't have good credit, but the husband will still have to come to closing and sign some documents. And so we need to look for little red flags like working through that. Advising the seller and evaluating offers. What is the challenge the agent faces in doing this? So you're advising the seller. As you advise the seller on these 5 offers and which one to accept, what's your risk as a listing agent with that seller?
That the buyer changes the terms of the financing?
Buyer could, yeah. And, your seller may be really unhappy saying, wow, I really wish I knew that could happen. There is a tendency for a seller when an agent advises them, of these 5 offers, this is, I've done the spreadsheet, and you've got the net, you got all that. We're looking for which one is most likely to close. And based on my experience in these kind of things, this one looks really good. Seller may see that as a guarantee. They may say, agent, you're really sending me down the road to these particular buyers. And they may be putting a lot of responsibility on you, the listing agent. And they're going to hold you responsible if the deal doesn't close. So you want to be careful that as you're advising them, that they don't take it so seriously that you could have a real challenge there in working through it. Because they need to understand, based on your experiences, here's what you're doing. The more experience you have, if you've got a seller, for example, who just went through a transaction that fell apart, remember, every transaction you do changes what you do on the next transaction. Your seller just had a change. It just had a transaction. It fell apart. And one of the reasons it fell apart is because the buyer change types of financing. There was a real problem with that. Seller says, I don't want to ever go through that again. What can we do to keep the buyer from being able to change financing? Well, they can do something, but it's a language that has to be prepared by an attorney. The seller can create language for special provisions that prohibits the buyer from closing with any financing other than what's in the contract unless they have permission from the seller. So depending on what the seller just went through, and by having that knowledge, you can help your seller understand, you already know these things could change, these things could change, these things could happen as you work through that. Does that make semi-sense?
Yes.
You want to be careful there. One of the things you have in your package, you've got the multiple offer, notice the multiple offer form, and you've got the seller's invitation to buyer submit new offer. I really like that form, the seller's invitation form. That's a Texas Realtor form, 1925. It's not a counter offer. And if a seller has multiple offers, he's got 5 offers, and he wants each of the more than just final and best offer, the seller can send this form out and it can be different for each buyer. Doesn't have to be the same. He can say to this buyer, I'd more favorably entertain your offer if you would change closing date or the price or the title company or this or that or whatever. It's not a counter offer and says so on the form, but this is how the seller can say to multiple buyers, do these things, and the language is there. The seller may more favorably consider if. And so it's a great form. I like the form, and I think it can be effectively used in a multiple offer. It can even be used in just a single offer situation where you've got a one offer for your seller, and your seller says, well, I don't actually want to counter the offer because I don't want to be kind of tied in case another offer comes in. So what can I do to encourage this one buyer to change your offer to improve it? Well, this form can be used in that. Doesn't just have to be a multiple offer scenario. Well, that's something that you can do there. Okay, now before I lose more people, because I see I have lost a few, there is something I want to touch on. One thing that I do want to, and not everybody was able to access the video because we had some difficulty there, but I did a video. I talked about a recent enforcement action by Trek against a major real estate brokerage. And the enforcement action was based on 2 primary issues. One, the timely delivery of the IABS form. And second, communicating an email the buyer's agent had to receive the day before closing and didn't get that to the buyer, and the numbers were different than a verbal they had before. Because the buyer's agent did not timely deliver the IABS form, and the day before closing, the buyer and the buyer's agent met with the foundation company and got a verbal estimate of cost for installing French drains and removal of excess dirt. And that cost for those 2 things came to about $18,000. That same day, at 4:40 in the afternoon, closing's 8 o'clock the next morning, that foundation company sent a written estimate that was different, that was more. And the buyer's agent did not send that to the buyer, and the buyer closed not knowing there was a higher estimate of cost. When you're in the middle of a transaction, it's absolutely your responsibility to stay on top of all the communication, what's going on, make sure that your client has everything before they close, all the information, but also the IABS form. Trek, in spite of recommendations from the administrative law judge, it was different. Trek fined the agent over $3,000, fined the brokerage over $2,000, fined the designated broker of that brokerage about $1,700 for those 2 main violations. And these types of things are public. It goes before the commission. They go into executive session. The attorney representing this brokerage did a great job, in spite of the results. So he made his case, and then the commissioners went into executive session to look at this case. Now, sometimes they have several cases. In this case, they only had that one case to review. It took them over an hour and a half, and they had a unanimous consent to find that brokerage and an agent in those numbers I just gave you. So they take it very seriously. We really need to stay on top of it. The big thing is, even though the buyer's agent said, yeah, I did give them the information about brokerage services form, the buyer's agent didn't have the documentation until the last transaction. There was a transaction part of the deal, which he had documentation then. We've been working with these buyers for like 3 months. Didn't have the earlier documentation, and Trex said, well, don't see the documentation, we don't believe you. And they find them. So you need to make sure you stay on top of that. The other thing, there was a thing that happened, Shalina, right earlier before this class, said that she had a question from an agent about when you're contacting buyers to work with buyers, you're prospecting, and a buyer tells you that they're in a buyer representation agreement with another realtor, with another buyer, or with another agent. And this agent was asking the question of Shalina and said they had heard in a KWRI class that continue to try to work this buyer and, follow up with them and try to see if you can't get them signed on something. But if they've told you they're in a buyer representation agreement with another realtor, with another agent, you have to stop the conversation, no more conversation. They would have to call you for anything else to happen. You have to leave them alone. This is both a rules of TREC violation, in which TREC says you can't continue to negotiate with someone if you know they're an exclusive representation agreement with another agent, with another license holder. And it's a violation of Article 16 of the NAR Code of Ethics to interfere with an exclusive representation agreement of another realtor. So you cannot do that. If you've heard that somewhere else, you need to let me know where you heard it so I can call them and correct them. That's a violation. You just cannot do it. Can't move through that process as you work through it. You just have to be very careful as you work through those things. We've covered a lot of stuff on this. We will have one more class in December. On top of my head, I don't remember the date. That'll be our wrap up for the end of the year stuff. And we'll kind of look at things that, lessons we've learned during this year and all those kinds of things and work through it. You guys are doing great out there. I greatly appreciate it. We're learning a lot of important things. A big thing that I want us to really remember is be safe out there. Continue to follow all the safe procedures. This COVID thing is not going away. Maybe the fact that we got a couple of vaccines theoretically coming up is causing people to relax a little bit. Don't do that because I see a lot of challenges with who's even going to be able to have the vaccine. As many of you know, my sweet wife is in a very high risk category, and she can't find out from her doctor or anybody if she's on the list and has any availability or not. So, we can't fall into a false sense of security, say, hey, we got this and everything's covered and whatever. So I'm willing to entertain. You guys have been very patient. Anything else that's popped up recently that you say, wow, how come we didn't talk about this? I really want to know about this, whatever that is. Anybody else have anything they want to touch on?
Question, Bob. This is Laura. Do you have recommendations based on the information about buyer's letters to the seller?
Yeah, this is something that even NAR touched on a little bit. The concept of a buyer sending a letter to the seller under the NAR guidelines creates potential discriminatory issues. However, we hear over and over again how buyers have sometimes been successful in obtaining a contract because they sent a letter, because a seller felt good about that buyer. Many sellers are it's very important to them who buys their house. And if this is a nice family that they want to have in this neighborhood and be friends with their neighbors and all that kind of stuff, sometimes that's a real plus. What we think we need to follow here is this needs to be the idea of the buyer. If the buyer says, yeah, we want to do this, we think it'll make a difference, sending a letter, we can certainly follow the instructions. That's a legal instruction of our buyer. I don't think we should come up with the idea. I think we follow the buyer's instruction as they kind of work through that. Does that make sense? We do have some new rules. And we'll probably talk about it in the December class. The NAR Code of Ethics has a new, in Article 10, a new standard practice 10-5 that deals with discriminatory issues. They've expanded on that. NAR has some new instructions in the manual, the 286-page manual that is how we implement and enforce the Code of Ethics. It can be very important.
Thank you.
Yeah, so let's just touch just briefly on the new contracts that are going to be coming out, the new TREC contracts. You all probably have heard that there are going to be some major changes. The biggest single change is going to be in dealing with the option fee. In fact, paragraph 23 in our current contracts totally goes away. The termination option paragraph, it gets moved to paragraph 5, the earnest money paragraph. And the big change is the earnest money will be paid to and submitted to the escrow agent, i.e. the title company. In fact, the option fee check will be made out to the title company, not the seller. The process that TREC is going through, they approved it in their November meeting. However, they had to hold things off just a little bit because they changed paragraph 23. They discovered there were a couple of forms that TREC has that specifically reference paragraph 23. One is a notice of termination of contract, and the other is a short sale addendum. And because of that, TREC has to pass a motion in their February meeting. So at TREC's public February meeting, they'll pass a motion so that it'll correct the language in those two addenda, or in the termination and the addendum. And in the February meeting, they'll approve that. So the new forms will become available for voluntary use as soon as they get published and as soon as the software companies do it, but it won't become mandatory until April 1st. So we'll have some time there to go through the process and train. For all practical purposes, the forms have been approved. The change in forms have been approved. 2 new addendums dealing with fixture leases and residential leases have also been approved. All they're doing is they're changing the language in these 2 things I just mentioned for formatting reasons, but these changes have been made. And so it will be in the future that title companies will receive and receipt the option fee and the earnest money both. And so we're going to have people from the title companies come and talk to us and have some training on how they're going to handle it, because every title company is going to have their own rules about how to do it. For example, they get the option fee and they get the earnest money. Do they hold on to the option fee until closing, or do they release it to the seller? The contract itself is silent on that, but the feeling is title companies have the ability to release the option fee to the seller immediately. Then you've got the process of, do we need to prove up the check is good and all those kinds of things. So we're going to have different title companies with different policies on how they go through and deal with it. It'll be a new world. We need to be prepared for it. So as soon as the February meeting is over, in case you have a listing and you get an offer on the new forms, which are available voluntarily but not mandatory, you know how to explain that to your seller. So your seller understands how that works and how it's going on. It's going to be a new world in dealing with a lot of these situations. So it's going to be very interesting as we work through it.
Bob, would it be prudent to wait on using the new contract until the addenda have been updated?
Oh yeah, so you won't even have them available. You won't even be able to use them until the February meeting.
Okay.
So they won't be in anything. You can't even pull them down on the TREC website except in a draft form.
Okay.
So you won't even be able to do that as you work through it. We'll also talk in the next meeting a little bit more about the seller's disclosure and our role in that. We're having some challenges in dealing with that. We've got a couple of situations that we're dealing with right now that comes down to really important communication as we work through. I just can't tell you how, I know you hear me say it a gazillion times, but how we communicate, the timing of communication and documentation of that communication is so critical.
Mhm.
We just have to get into those habits and just do it and do it every time. Just habits that have to be there to work through it. Any questions anybody have? Because I'm pretty well finished with today. I do want to wish everybody a very, very safe, happy Thanksgiving. If you've ordered up, be sure and pick up your pie tomorrow as you work through it. Hopefully everybody is going to be safe with having their family there or not there, whatever. Carol said happy Thanksgiving to everybody. Thanksgiving to all of you guys. My wife and I are having a special day today. This is our 53rd wedding anniversary.
Happy anniversary.
So we're having a pretty cool day today to work through it. We're gonna have dinner brought in. We'll have family here, and we're gonna have. I think she's chosen that she'd like El Phoenix, so we're gonna have El Phoenix tonight. Work
Oh,
through that. So we're pretty excited. It's gonna be pretty cool.
awesome.
That's
Same
good.
week I get happy anniversary and I get Thanksgiving. So we'll work through.
It's a good
She's
week,
been up
Bob.
with you for 53 years?
I know, isn't that hard to imagine? In fact, when we had a public party a few years ago, like when our 50th wedding anniversary, and this is before COVID, obviously. And when people came to that party, which our adult children put on,